Tale Podcast: How Stories Shape and Change Our Lives. Thanks once more for joining me on this fourth installment of my introductory series on learning how to engage with and incorporate the wisdom of stories through myth and fairy tales, as well as how we're learning how to read and interact more consciously with our own individual stories about ourselves. This episode is dedicated to investigating the phenomenon of the individual human psyche as a collection of multiple parts, in addition to the multitude of stories about us those parts are carrying. In this episode, I will also introduce the concept of the human shadow, as first articulated by the late Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung in the early 20th century, and further explored, expanded on, and imagined through the lens and practice of the depth psychology movement, as well as the modern mythological movements. It's important to introduce the idea of the shadow in this particular episode, simply because most of the stories we are carrying around about ourselves live there, in those hidden places of the human psyche. Speaking of the individual human psyche as multiple in nature gives us some more insight into what's going on behind the scenes of our everyday waking lives. In the first episode, I referred to our human nature as essentially being relationship itself. And while it is one thing to recognize the nature of relationship, it's another thing entirely to experience ourselves both as relationship and in relationship to other people and other things. The mechanism of the human ego is what allows us to do this, and I'll say more about that as we continue forward. Each part of the human psyche creates and belongs to an internal ecosystem, which we might loosely describe as a whole that is made up of many parts. And each part of us is different and unique in its expression of the personality, which again is multiple in nature. These parts belong to us and are just as important and useful to us as any other part of the human body that we use. As such, it's important to learn what they are and also to learn how to take good care of them. These parts of us belong to us. They're with us throughout our lives, and they are what make us each individually unique. Stories, on the other hand, are the transient parts of the human psyche. They come and go, sometimes for long periods of time and sometimes for short ones. Some stories are so powerful, mesmerizing, and convincing to us that we understandably confuse them with or as a part of ourselves. Stories often serve different purposes for different periods of time and different periods of life. And then as we grow up and we change, they're replaced by new stories that are more reflective of who we are in our lives now. Stories can be positive, negative, or simply neutral for us. Some stories can bring great healing and restoration, while other stories bring pain or harm or exacerbate our wounds. And I've identified, again, shame stories in the second episode as one such manifestation of that. We follow stories about ourselves in our continued efforts to make sense of who we are and what we feel our purpose is in life. We create our own stories, and we also live out the older stories that other people have written about us that we have accepted and adopted as our own. And while this more typically happens when we are young children, it can and very much does continue to happen throughout any or all stages and phases of life. As I stated before, most of the stories we are carrying around with us, we remain unaware of as we go about our daily lives and our daily business. In the first episode, I introduced the idea of the ego, or more specifically, the ego consciousness, which I have made synonymous with wakened consciousness. The ego is the part of us that gives us the experience of differentiation and also of opposites. We would not be able to grasp the concept of the individual, for instance, in contrast to the many or multiple or even the whole, without the ego's ability to make distinctions. Without the sensation of individualness, we would not be able to know or experience relationship, the ability to relate to other people or other things that we perceive as separate or different from us in some way. That is the mechanism of the ego. The various jobs of the human ego include having an ability to organize information that we receive and put it into our matrix in a way that makes sense to us or is pertinent to us in some important way. It's also the part of us that knows how to make decisions, solve problems, make a plan, and also execute our various tasks in life. But the primary task of the human ego is to be the supreme protector of the status quo. And the status quo is whatever predominant story about ourselves we have chosen and accepted to promote, protect, and project into the world. This predominant story of ourselves becomes our ego ideal. Now, the human ego can be an extremely curious part of us, but only to the extent that it recognizes any new information in accordance with its own parameters and assumptions that the ego ideal itself is carrying. It will eagerly add any new bit of information that we discover about ourselves in this way, again, as long as it's in accordance with its own confirmation bias. Conversely, it will simply ignore or reject all other evidence of anything else that may be true about us that doesn't fit into that ideal. And the only time the ego really gets its feathers ruffled is when it encounters the possibility of a new story about ourselves that may be powerful enough or enough of a threat to dethrone its position as protector of the current status quo. Okay, so that's a lot. And before we get too ahead of ourselves, it's important real quick to understand a few more things. First and foremost, the human ego appears to be a given condition of consciousness. Even as it is experienced and interpreted in many different ways, depending on one's culture and location in the world, as well as the corresponding myths. We also have a lot of recent modern interpretations of what the human ego is and what it isn't, including movements that purport to help us become egoless. One of the more recent terms floating around that we can hear is called ego death. And again, since I believe the human ego to be a fundamental part of the human psyche, I don't think we can get rid of it, even if we wanted to, as evidenced by someone I once overheard in a crowd bragging to a friend of theirs that they had proudly, quote unquote, achieved ego death. And hopefully the problematic nature of that statement is evident in and of itself. Because the human ego is more or less a fixed component of the human psyche, I believe rather we need to learn how to work with it differently than we have been taught to. Our global culture or overculture of modernity, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States, tends to project a lot of false ideas and assumptions onto the concept of ego itself. As an example, I think most of us tend to, for instance, use that word as a term of derision for someone we believe is getting a little too full of themselves. We'll say things like, that person has a really big ego. Now, ego inflation is real. It does exist, and unfortunately, I think it is more or less held up as a virtue, particularly for men, again, particularly in the United States, to be emulated and idolized. But an ego inflation is not the only form of a protected ego ideal story. Remember that the human ego serves as protector for whatever story about ourselves we have chosen to identify most with. And while the human ego can and will protect an inflated version of itself, it will also protect a deflated version of itself in the form of a powerful shame story, if that is the predominant story that has won the day, that we have chosen to identify most with. In this sense, the term ideal is not necessarily about improving our self-image as much as it is about, again, protecting and projecting whatever story we have chosen that has been convincing enough for us to adopt. Okay, I know that's a lot to take in, and we haven't even gotten around to the human shadow just yet, but be patient, we're almost there. Because the human ego is so diligent in its tasks and so good at what it does, its common blind spot is to continuously assume and believe that it is the only part of the overall self that actually exists, and that there's really no such thing as an inner community of other parts and other stories within the human psyche. So, if these parts in fact do exist, where do they go when the human ego has rejected them? You guessed it, the human shadow. Now, this phenomenon is way too dense to try and compact everything that we could possibly learn and know about it into one episode. Not only will I be dedicating several episodes in the future to further explorations of this topic, it will more or less continue to be a recurring theme that's present throughout almost everything and anything that we talk about. For our purposes here, it's important to understand why developing an ability to be more curious and aware of the various parts and stories of our shadow selves is crucial to our ability to see what else is driving us and motivating us in our daily lives. Our shadow parts and their corresponding stories of us, they're not just sitting there quietly dormant down in the depths, patiently waiting for us to pay attention to them. Rather, these shadow parts are very active and are working very hard to get our attention and to try to express themselves in the world in any way that they can. And when we choose to remain unaware of this phenomenon, or just simply ignore it, we develop what depth psychology calls a complex, and then these shadow parts come out in the form of projections. The human shadow and everything that lives in there is far more vast than our conscious waking selves could ever really comprehend, and it's really more closely connected to what Carl Jung described as the collective unconscious. Yet another really big idea for another episode or 2 or 3. Jung's metaphor for describing the contrast between the significance of the human ego as compared to the collective unconscious was to suggest the image of a small cork bobbing up and down on the waves of a vast and endless ocean of water. In light of that particular metaphor, it seems kind of funny to think of the human ego carrying around the idea that it's the only thing that exists or the only thing that's real in terms of the human psyche. And we can see how easy it is for us to fall into the idea that the human ego is a problem then that must be solved or eliminated if we're trying to do our depth work or our shadow work. It's what stands in the way, after all, in terms of our abilities to explore more of what has been relegated to our own shadows. This is a powerful example of why learning how to balance the tension of opposites within us is an important skill for us to learn to develop. Without it, our inclination is to just be at constant war with ourselves, which again produces constant war with each other as we keep throwing our projections at others instead of learning how to see them accurately, take responsibility for them, and work with them ourselves. The ego self and the shadow self comprise perhaps one of the most powerful and most difficult internal balancing acts we must learn how to navigate. This idea of learning how to balance powerful opposites within us is a topic that I'm going to explore more in depth in the next episode. One thing that is so important to remember, even as we branch out into all sorts of different spaces, ideas, and concepts, when it comes to the work of healing, wholeness, growth, and individuation, is that all the parts of ourselves, as well as all the different stories that they are carrying within us, are in fact working as hard as they can in the only ways that they know how to protect and to defend us in some way, regardless of how maladaptive their methods may be. When the human ego is protecting a story about us that we come to experience, for instance, as a shame story perhaps, as punishing, oppressive, degrading, or just simply no longer relevant to who we are and who we are becoming, our task is not then to go to war with our ego, and certainly not to try to kill it off. With either attempt, the ego will simply assert itself and fight back even harder, as would be the response of any part of ourselves that we would choose to go to war with. Our job instead is to teach our ego selves how to let go of an old story we once asked it to protect, and learn to slowly but surely over time accept and protect the newer, better, truer narrative we are now asking it to protect and defend for us. We need to slowly convince our ego that it's not, in fact, out of a job, but we do need it to grow and adapt and apply itself in a different way with a better story about us that we want it to promote and protect and defend for us. Our primary orientation and method for doing this successfully lies in our ability to practice that slow or receptive energy that I've been talking about. The ego tends to like to go fast, and this can help us teach our ego to slow itself down so it can eventually learn to acknowledge the existence of the other parts and stories of ourselves and to begin to learn to make some room for them. Any discipline we might adopt to try to either avoid or kill off the human ego becomes an evasion then of the work of inner reconciliation. The desire is understandable. We would all like some trick that will solve whatever it is we perceive as a barrier, threat, or a problem that stands between ourselves and our work. Thinking that way, however, is to accept the premise that we as human beings are little more than problems to be solved. We need to see and accept the presence of resistance, for instance, as necessary to our work. Resistances themselves are a part of the reconciliation process because they show us exactly where and how we have been creating internal barriers to our own healing process. Shadow work appears to be hard work, and it is. But what the work reveals to us is that the process of human healing is the process of relationship itself. And relationship requires, at the very least, the elements of both habit plus time. This is why so-called magic tricks, whether in the form of a psychotherapeutic technique, religious or spiritual practices, or other forms of self-help methods that promote a one-stop shop approach, don't really work and tend to leave us wanting. They may provide some temporary relief, but they have not taught us how to build and practice restorative relationship with ourselves, or to investigate the uninvestigated parts and stories of ourselves that are still feeling neglected, wounded, and abandoned, and still fighting hard to get our attention. The work of wholeness is a journey of discovering and rediscovering the truths of who we already are, even if our journeys to rediscover that take us far away from ourselves, far away from home. The work of wholeness asks us to find a way back to ourselves, but in ways that are helping us to develop more consciousness, more compassion, and hopefully more wisdom. One of the overarching stories that we all carry because our dominant culture continues to promote it are the stories of our very human nature as being fundamentally broken or flawed. They teach us that our home is not in ourselves, but somewhere else. Be it some form of heaven, utopian fantasy, or even in corporate products that rely on our self-loathing to sell us more products that promise to emulate happiness and self-confidence, but in the end only make those experiences worse for us, teaching us instead to be more punishing rather than more compassionate towards ourselves. The real work of individuation is not about conquest of the self or even mastery of the self. It's really about learning how to accept and love ourselves for exactly who we are. I really love this quote from James Hollis, which comes from his book, Through the Dark Wood, which I think captures beautifully what the work actually is. He states that, quote, "To become a person does not necessarily mean well-adjusted, well-adapted, approved of by others. It means to become who you are. We are meant to become more eccentric, more peculiar, more odd. We're not just meant to fit in. We are here to be different. We are here to be the individual." This is the work of restorative relationship, inner reconciliation. It is the work of healing and wholeness. How we are learning to work with our inner stories is the same orientation and posture we must take when we are reading other powerful stories, the likes of which come from myths and fairy tales. This orientation is what allows us to be illuminated by them and enhanced by them, enlightened by them on a soul level by powerful stories themselves. And this is the real magic. So, we're a little over halfway through this introductory series, 2 more to go. As I previously stated in the next episode, I'm going to go more in depth about the experience of opposites and the tension they produce. And I will also be introducing the archetypal motif of the trickster. So stay tuned because things are getting exciting. And I look forward to having you join me for that. As always, take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.